Dad, when the wedding date is finalized, you'll be one of the first people to know. Those were the last words my daughter said to me about her wedding. 3 months later, I was standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, staring at my phone while my son-in-law calmly told me, "We got married last night." I honestly thought I had misheard him. "What do you mean last night?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he laughed softly and said something I still hear in my head almost every day. It was a small event. Only important people attended. We didn't want anyone embarrassing the family. I remember gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. My daughter never got on the phone. She never explained. She never apologized. The worst part wasn't missing the wedding. The worst part was realizing they had planned the whole thing while looking me in the eye for months. If you enjoy stories about family, loyalty, and the hard lessons life teaches us, please consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, leave a comment telling me your city or country and what your local time is. I always enjoy seeing where people are watching from. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of the phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The lesson I learned from all of this took me a long time to understand, and if you stay until the end, you'll see exactly why. Now let me take you back to where this all began. A week before that phone call, life felt normal. Quiet, maybe, but normal. I lived alone in the same two-story house Susan and I had bought nearly 40 years earlier. The paint on the porch was beginning to fade, and the maple tree in the front yard was taller than the roof now. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee, local news, a slow walk to the mailbox. I had retired from construction engineering nearly a decade earlier, and after Susan passed away 6 years ago, routines became important. They kept the house from feeling too empty. Emily was my only child, my daughter, the center of my world for most of my life. When she was little, she used to run down the hallway in princess costumes that dragged across the floor. When she was 16, she made me sit through 3 hours of dance rehearsals because she wanted my opinion. When she graduated college, she hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. We were close, or at least I believed we were. Ethan entered the picture about 4 years before the wedding. On paper, he seemed perfect, well-dressed, good job, smart, ambitious. The kind of guy who always seemed to know exactly what to say in a room full of strangers. The first time we met, he shook my hand and said, "Emily tells me you built half the city." I laughed. "Not quite half." "Still impressive," he said. At the time, I liked him. Looking back now, I realized there were small things that bothered me. Tiny moments that felt strange but easy to ignore. He talked about status more than people, success more than happiness, appearances more than relationships. At family dinners, he would casually mention who earned 6 figures, who belonged to which country club, who owned vacation property in Florida. Emily would smile and tell me, "That's just Ethan being Ethan." So I let it go. One evening about 8 months before the wedding, we were having dinner at a restaurant downtown. Ethan was talking about a business event. "You'd be surprised how many doors open when you're around the right people," he said. "The right people?" I asked. "You know," he replied, "people who matter." Something about the way he said it stayed with me. Not because it was rude, because it sounded sincere, like he truly believed some people carried more value than others. I remember glancing at Emily. She looked uncomfortable for a second before changing the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wish I had. Because years later, after everything happened, I would look back on that dinner and realize it was the first clue. The first sign that something had been quietly building behind my back long before that phone call ever came. And the truth was far worse than simply being left off a guest list. As I sat there remembering that dinner years ago, my mind kept drifting even further back, to a time long before Ethan was ever part of our lives. Emily was 7 when Susan and I bought her a little blue bicycle with white handlebars. I still remember the look on her face when she saw it sitting in the driveway on a warm Saturday morning. She dropped her cereal spoon into the bowl and ran straight outside. "Dad, is that really mine?" she asked. "It is if you promise not to crash into my mailbox," I told her. She laughed and hugged me so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Those were the years when life felt simple. Every Friday night was pizza night. Every summer we drove 3 hours to Lake Erie. Every Christmas, Susan insisted on hanging far too many lights around the house. Emily was the kind of kid who left handwritten notes everywhere. Sometimes I would find one in my lunchbox that said, "Have a good day, Dad." Sometimes one would be taped to the bathroom mirror. Looking back now, those little scraps of paper are worth more to me than almost anything I own. But even back then, there were signs that Emily hated disappointing people. If a teacher looked upset, she would blame herself. If a friend was angry, she would immediately try to fix it. Susan noticed it before I did. One night after Emily went to bed, Susan said, "She worries too much about making everyone happy." I shrugged. "She is just kind." Susan slowly shook her head. Kind and afraid are not always the same thing. At the time, I thought she was overthinking it. Years later, I realized she had been right. After Susan passed away, something changed in Emily. Not all at once. It was gradual. The phone calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. Every conversation seemed rushed. I told myself that was normal. She had her own life, her own career, her own future. Then Ethan came along. In the beginning, he seemed to admire her. He always had a plan, always had an opinion, always knew what restaurant everyone should eat at or where everyone should sit. Small things, harmless things, or at least they looked harmless at first. I remember one family barbecue in my backyard. Emily wanted hamburgers. Ethan wanted steaks. Emily suggested we keep it simple. Ethan smiled and said, "Trust me, people remember quality." An hour later, everyone was eating steaks. It was a tiny moment, but I noticed something. Emily stopped arguing halfway through the conversation. She simply nodded. A few months later, we were all having dinner together when Emily mentioned wanting a small wedding someday. "I never cared about big events," she said. "I would be happy with close family and a backyard." Ethan laughed softly. "You say that now. What does that mean?" she asked. "It means some occasions are too important to waste on small thinking." Nobody said anything after that. The conversation moved on, but I caught Emily staring down at her plate. It only lasted a second. Then she smiled again. The same smile she always used when she wanted everyone around her to feel comfortable. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Parents do that. We tell ourselves everything is fine because the alternative is harder to face. What I did not know was that behind those polite smiles and quiet dinners, decisions were already being made. Conversations were already happening. And somewhere along the way, my daughter had started keeping secrets that would eventually change everything. Over the next year, something unexpected happened. For the first time since Susan passed away, I stopped merely maintaining my life and started building something again. A former colleague called me one afternoon and asked if I would consider consulting on a large commercial renovation project outside Dayton. At first, I laughed. "I am 71 years old, Tom." He laughed too. "And you still know more than half the people doing the work." What was supposed to be a short conversation turned into a 6-month consulting contract. I was not doing physical labor. Mostly planning, reviewing reports, solving problems, and mentoring younger engineers. The work gave me purpose again. It got me out of the house. It gave structure to my weeks. More importantly, it reminded me that I was still useful. One Friday evening, after receiving my first major consulting payment, I called Emily. "Guess what?" I said. "What happened?" she asked. I could hear traffic in the background. "Looks like your old man is working again." She laughed. "Dad, that is great." For a moment, she sounded like the little girl who used to leave notes in my lunchbox. "I am proud of you," she said. Those 5 words meant more to me than the check. A few weeks later, I used part of the money to finally replace my aging pickup truck. Nothing fancy, just a reliable new Ford. When I drove it home, my neighbor Frank walked across the street. "Well, look at you," he said. "Retirement must be treating you pretty well." I smiled. Not retirement. Apparently, I failed retirement. For the first time in years, life felt like it was moving forward instead of standing still. But around that same time, I started noticing a strange shift whenever Ethan was around. The first sign came during a family dinner. He was asking questions about the consulting project. "How much longer is the contract?" he asked. "Maybe another few months," I said. "Good money?" "Good enough." He nodded slowly. "That is impressive." The compliment sounded normal, but something about it felt different, more calculated. Later that evening, Emily mentioned that they were looking at apartments closer to downtown Columbus. Ethan immediately jumped into the conversation. "Some of those places are expensive," he said. Then he looked at me and smiled. "Good thing successful people know successful people." I chuckled politely, but I noticed Emily glance at him. It was the same look I had seen before. A brief flash of discomfort that disappeared almost instantly. A few days later, Emily invited me for coffee. We sat near the window of a small cafe we both liked. Halfway through our conversation, she asked, "Dad, have you thought about traveling more?" "Maybe someday," I said. "Why?" She stirred her coffee without looking up. "Just wondering." There was something she wanted to say. I could feel it. Normally, I would have filled the silence. Normally, I would have asked questions until I got answers. But this time I did something different. I waited. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Never mind," she said. And for the first time in my life, I let it go. I did not push. I did not chase the conversation. Looking back, that moment mattered more than I realized. Because not long afterward, invitations started being discussed, venues started being visited, plans started taking shape, and somewhere behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would reveal exactly where I stood in their new life. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The changes were small enough to explain away. Emily stopped mentioning wedding plans whenever we talked. If I asked how things were going, she would smile and say, "Everything is fine, Dad." Then she would immediately change the subject. One afternoon, I called her while she was driving home from work. "Have you picked a venue yet?" I asked. There was a pause. "We are still looking." "That sounds exciting." "Yeah." Another pause. Then she said, "I have to go. Ethan is calling." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. A few days later, my sister Linda called me. "So, have you seen the guest list?" she asked. "What guest list?" I said. She sounded confused. "The preliminary one Emily showed Aunt Karen." I sat up straighter in my chair. "Emily showed people a guest list? I assume she showed you first." After we hung up, I stared at my phone for several minutes. Not because I was angry. Because something felt wrong. That evening I called Emily. Linda mentioned a guest list. "Oh," she said, "Aunt Karen saw it. It is still changing. Can I see it?" Another silence. "I do not think Ethan wants to share it yet." That answer bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Over the next month, similar moments kept happening. Relatives seemed to know details that I did not. Family friends casually mentioned venues I had never heard about. One neighbor even congratulated me on the wedding date before I knew there was a date. "September is a beautiful month for a wedding," he said while we were both checking our mail. I forced a smile. "It sure is." The truth was I had no idea what he was talking about. That night I called Emily again. "September?" I asked. "Who told you that?" She replied immediately. "So it is September?" Another pause. "Dad, nothing is finalized." I noticed she never actually answered the question. Around that time, Ethan started becoming unusually friendly. He would call just to chat. He asked about my consulting work. He asked about retirement investments. He asked whether I planned to keep the house long term. At first, I thought he was trying to build a better relationship with me. Looking back now, the conversations felt more like information gathering than genuine interest. One Sunday afternoon, we met for lunch. Ethan spent nearly 20 minutes talking about rising housing costs. "Young couples have it rough right now," he said. "Everything is expensive." "That is true," I replied. "Sometimes family has to help family," he added casually. The comment seemed harmless. Emily immediately looked down at her drink. I noticed it. So did he. Nobody said anything. The subject changed, but the feeling stayed with me. Then came the moment that finally shook me. I was having coffee with an old friend when he said, "I heard Emily is planning quite an event." "Maybe," I said carefully. "The country club is not cheap." My stomach dropped. "Country club?" He nodded. "Everybody is talking about it." Everybody, apparently, except me. Driving home, I kept replaying every conversation in my head. Every half answer. Every awkward pause. Every detail that never quite made sense. For months, a version of the story had been circulating among relatives, friends, and acquaintances. Plans were moving forward. Expectations were being set. People believed they knew what was happening because someone was giving them information. Yet somehow, the father of the bride remained on the outside looking in. And as I pulled into my driveway that evening, I saw a missed call from Emily waiting on my phone, along with a voicemail that would make everything come crashing down. The voicemail was only 23 seconds long, but I listened to it at least a dozen times that night. Emily sounded nervous. Not frightened, not upset, just nervous. "Hey Dad, call me when you get this. There are some things happening pretty fast right now, and I know we need to talk." That was all she said. No explanation, no details, just enough to make me worry. I called her back immediately. No answer. I waited an hour and tried again. Straight to voicemail. The next morning I sent a text. "Everything okay?" Nothing. Around lunchtime I tried calling again. Nothing. By evening I started feeling something I had not felt in years. Helplessness. Not because of a crisis. Because I could sense a wall going up and I did not understand why. Over the next 2 weeks, I made every reasonable effort to reconnect. I called every few days. I left calm messages. I sent short texts. I avoided sounding upset because I did not want her to feel pressured. One message read, "Just checking in. Hope you are doing well." Another said, "Coffee this weekend if you have time." Days passed without replies. Then one afternoon I finally received a text. It was only 4 words. "Busy. Talk later, Dad." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Not because the message was rude, because it felt strangely formal. Emily had never spoken to me that way before. Around that time, other things started happening. Family members began mentioning plans they assumed I already knew about. My cousin Robert called and asked, "What color are you wearing?" "For what?" I asked. "The ceremony." I laughed awkwardly. "I have no idea." There was silence on the line. "You do not know?" he asked. "Know what?" He quickly changed the subject, but the damage was already done. A few days later, I decided to write Emily an email. Not because I thought email was better, but because sometimes people read things they do not answer. I kept it simple. I told her I loved her. I told her I missed talking to her. I told her that if something was bothering her, I hoped she would tell me. 3 days later, I received a response. It was less than 30 words. "Everything is fine. We are just busy with life and planning. Please do not worry." That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me feel worse. The message sounded like it had been written for a coworker, not a father. Then I tried something old-fashioned. I wrote a handwritten letter. Susan always believed letters mattered because people could hold them in their hands. I spent nearly an hour writing it. I told Emily about the maple tree blooming in the front yard. I told her about a funny story from the consulting project. I told her I was proud of her. A week later, the envelope came back. Wrong apartment number. Return to sender. I sat at my kitchen table holding that unopened letter while the afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the room. The house felt larger than usual, quieter than usual. Every attempt to bridge the distance seemed to fail before it even began. Calls went unanswered. Texts went nowhere. Emails produced polite walls instead of conversations. Even a letter could not find its destination. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. I started wondering whether I was being intentionally kept outside a life that was moving forward without me. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of my life. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into a house and stays there. Every room seemed to remind me of someone who was no longer present. Susan was gone. Emily was slipping further away. Even the routine phone calls that used to break up the week had disappeared. One Saturday morning, I found myself standing in the garage looking through old storage boxes. I was not searching for anything specific. I think I was just trying to feel connected to a version of my life that still made sense. Inside one box were dozens of photographs. Emily at age 8 holding a fishing pole that was bigger than she was. Emily at her high school graduation. Emily standing between Susan and me during a family trip to Lake Erie. I sat down on an old folding chair and spent nearly 2 hours looking through those pictures. At one point, I found a Father's Day card she had made when she was 10 years old. The front was covered in glitter. Inside, she had written, "Thank you for always showing up." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I carefully put the card back in the box. That evening, my sister Linda called. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Fine," I said automatically. "Michael." I laughed softly. "You always know when I am lying. Because you sound exactly like your father when you do it." We talked for nearly an hour, mostly about ordinary things. The weather, her grandchildren, the consulting project. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. You keep acting like you lost an argument. What do you mean? I asked. Maybe you did not lose an argument, she said. Maybe you learned something. After the call ended, I sat alone in my living room thinking about that. Learned something. The truth was that I had spent months assuming I could fix whatever was happening. One more phone call, one more conversation, one more explanation. But slowly, I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. Relationships only work when both people want them to work. You cannot carry the entire weight by yourself forever. A few days later, Emily finally called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. How have you been? She asked. Doing okay. Good. There was an awkward pause. Work still going well? She asked. It is. Another pause. The conversation felt polite, careful, like two strangers trying not to offend each other. Before hanging up, I almost asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for months. Why are you pulling away from me? Instead, I said, take care of yourself, kiddo. You too, Dad. When the call ended, I realized something important. I no longer felt angry. I felt tired. But underneath that exhaustion was something new. Clarity. For months, I had been standing outside a closed door waiting for someone to open it. That night, for the first time, I stopped waiting. And only a few days later, an unexpected conversation would reveal that the story I had been told was not the real story at all. After that conversation, I stopped measuring my life by who called me back and started measuring it by what I actually did with my days. The consulting contract eventually ended, but instead of slowing down, I accepted another project. Then another. Word spread among former colleagues that I was available, and before long I was spending 3 days a week advising younger engineers across Ohio. Most of them were 30 or 40 years younger than me. At first I thought they would see me as outdated. Instead, they treated me like someone whose experience still mattered. One morning, a project manager named Kevin called me from a job site outside Cincinnati. Michael, we have been staring at this problem for 2 days. That sounds expensive, I joked. He laughed. Can you come take a look? By lunchtime, I was standing beside a conference table covered with blueprints. After about 20 minutes, I pointed to a design issue everyone else had missed. The room went quiet. Then Kevin looked at me and said, "You just saved us weeks." Driving home that evening felt different. Not because of the money, because I realized something simple. My value had never disappeared. I had simply spent too much time waiting for certain people to acknowledge it. Around the same time, I started making small changes at home. I repainted the front porch. I finally fixed the loose fence gate Susan used to complain about. I joined a local community group that restored historical buildings. Every Thursday afternoon, I worked alongside volunteers who cared more about preserving old brick walls than social status. One of them, a retired teacher named Martha, noticed I seemed happier. "You smile more now," she said while we were scraping old paint from a window frame. "Do I?" I asked. "You do." I thought about that for a second. Maybe I finally got tired of feeling sorry for myself. She nodded. That usually helps. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden breakthrough, just hundreds of small choices that slowly rebuilt a life I had neglected while focusing on relationships I could not control. Even my house felt different. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger engineers I had mentored recommended me for an industry recognition award. I almost declined the nomination because it seemed unnecessary. Kevin refused to let me. "You spent decades helping people," he said. "Let somebody say thank you." A few months later, I attended a banquet in Columbus. Nothing extravagant. Just a room full of professionals sharing stories and eating overcooked chicken. When my name was announced, several people stood and applauded. As I walked toward the stage, I caught myself looking around for Susan. Old habits die hard. For a second, I wish she could have seen it. Then I smiled anyway. After the event, my phone filled with messages from former coworkers. "Congratulations, proud of you. Well deserved." One message even came from someone I had not spoken to in 15 years. As I sat in my truck reading those texts, I realized something important. The people who genuinely valued me had never disappeared. I had simply been looking in the wrong direction, and although I did not know it yet, the stability I was building during that season of my life was about to become very important. Because before long, News would arrive that would completely change the balance of power in a situation I thought was already finished. Over the next year, the work that had started as a distraction slowly became something more meaningful. I was no longer the retired engineer trying to stay busy. I had become the person companies called when a project stalled and nobody could figure out why. One morning I arrived at a job site outside Cleveland and was handed a bright white hard hat with my name printed across the front. Underneath my name were two words: Senior Consultant. I stood there for a second staring at it. It was just a hard hat, just plastic and paint. But after everything that had happened, it felt like proof that I still had a place in the world. "Looks good on you," Kevin said. "Makes me look older," I replied. He laughed. That ship sailed years ago. The younger engineers began asking for advice regularly. Some of them called me before making major decisions. Others invited me to training sessions just so I could share stories about projects from decades earlier. One afternoon, a young engineer named Rachel stopped me after a meeting. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. How do you stay calm when everyone else is panicking?" I smiled. "You live long enough. You realize most problems are not as permanent as they look." She wrote that down in a notebook. I remember laughing because I was not trying to sound wise. I was simply telling the truth. Around that time, the Historical Restoration Group elected me to their advisory board. The title sounded more impressive than the actual job, but seeing my name on official documents still felt strange. For years, I had been focused on what was missing. Now I was surrounded by reminders of what remained: friends, purpose, respect, work that mattered. One Thursday evening, after finishing a restoration meeting, Martha handed me a folder. "What is this?" I asked. "Open it." Inside was a certificate recognizing volunteer contributions to local preservation projects. My name was printed across the top. "You did not have to do this," I said. "We wanted to," she replied. "People notice when someone shows up consistently." That sentence stayed with me. People notice when someone shows up consistently. Years earlier, Emily had written almost the same thing in a Father's Day card. The memory no longer made me sad. It simply reminded me of who I had always tried to be. By then, my days felt full again. Mornings started with coffee and project reviews. Afternoons were spent visiting job sites or attending meetings. Evenings were quieter, but no longer lonely. The house felt lived in again. Not because anyone new had moved in, but because I had finally stopped treating my life like something that was waiting to restart. Then one Friday night, after returning home from an awards dinner, I sat down in my recliner and looked at the plaque they had given me. It reflected the lamplight from across the room. I remember thinking how strange life could be. Sometimes the moments that rebuild your confidence happen so gradually that you barely notice them. Other times they arrive all at once. My phone buzzed on the side table. I glanced at the screen. A name appeared that I had not heard from in quite some time. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it, because that call would connect everything back to the situation I thought I had finally left behind. The name on my screen was Emily. For a moment, I simply looked at it. Nearly 2 years had passed since the distance between us began growing into something neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. I answered on the third ring. "Hello?" There was a brief pause. "Dad?" Her voice sounded different. Not weaker, just tired. "Hi, kiddo." Another pause. "Do you have a minute?" I looked around my living room. The award plaque was still sitting on the side table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. "I have all the time you need." She let out a long breath. "I think we should talk." Those words carried more weight than she probably realized. For months, maybe years, I had been the one trying to start conversations. Now she was calling me. "Okay," I said carefully. "What would you like to talk about?" "Not over the phone." My stomach tightened slightly. "Then where? Could we meet tomorrow?" The next afternoon, we agreed to meet at a small cafe on the north side of Columbus. It was the same place where we had shared coffee years earlier when she seemed like she wanted to tell me something but never did. I arrived 15 minutes early. Old habit. I ordered black coffee and chose a table near the window. Outside, people moved through the parking lot carrying shopping bags and talking on their phones. Ordinary life continued around me while my mind kept replaying possibilities. I was not nervous exactly, but I knew something important was coming. Emily arrived a few minutes later. The first thing I noticed was how carefully she smiled. It was polite, controlled. The same expression she used whenever she was trying to manage someone else's feelings. "Hi, Dad." "Hi." We hugged briefly and sat down. For the first few minutes, neither of us talked about anything important. We discussed work, the weather, my volunteer projects, her apartment, small topics, safe topics. Then the conversation slowed. She stirred her coffee even though she had not added anything to it. I recognized the gesture immediately. She used to do the same thing as a teenager whenever she was worried. Finally, she looked up. "You seem good." I smiled. "I am good. You look different." "Different how?" "Happier." That surprised me. "I guess I am." She nodded slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she glanced toward the window and said something I had not expected. "I do not think I ever thanked you." "For what?" I asked. "For not making everything harder." I sat back slightly. "Emily, I never wanted things to be hard." She stared down at her coffee cup. "I know." The tension at the table felt different now. Not hostile, not angry. More like two people standing near a door that had been closed for a long time. Neither of us quite knew how to open it. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and immediately turned it face down. I noticed the movement. So did she. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated. "Yeah." But the answer came too quickly. Another silence settled between us. This one lasted longer. Finally, Emily folded her hands together and looked directly at me. There was sadness in her eyes, but there was something else too. Relief. As if she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally decided to put it down. "Dad," she said quietly, "there is something you never knew about what happened back then." And for the first time, I realized the story I had been telling myself all these years was missing a piece I had never seen. Emily kept her eyes on the table for several seconds before speaking again. "The apartment was never really our idea," she said quietly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a slow breath. "A lot of the decisions people thought we were making together were not actually being made together." I said nothing. She continued. "For a long time, I thought keeping the peace was the same thing as being supportive." There was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion. "And eventually?" I asked. "Eventually I realized I had been agreeing to things I did not even want." The cafe around us seemed unusually quiet. Cups clinked against saucers. A barista called out someone's order. Life continued as normal while my daughter carefully unfolded a truth she had apparently carried for years. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Emily looked directly at me. "Because I finally stopped pretending." That answer hit harder than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, because it sounded honest. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. She slid it across the table toward me. "What is this?" "Look at it." I unfolded the paper. At first I thought it was some kind of financial statement. Then I saw the letterhead. It was from a property management company. Below that was a list of overdue balances, several months' worth. I slowly looked back up at her. "Emily," she nodded. "Things are not what they appear to be." "Does Ethan know you are showing me this?" Another pause. "No." I sat back in my chair. Suddenly several things started making sense. Not everything, but enough. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad enough that I cannot keep pretending everything is fine." She rubbed her forehead. "People think we are successful. They think we have everything under control. And you do not?" A sad smile crossed her face. "Dad, appearances are expensive." For the next 20 minutes, she spoke more openly than she had in years. Not to blame anyone, not to justify anything. Just facts. Numbers, decisions, pressures, expectations. I listened carefully without interrupting. When she finally finished, she looked relieved and terrified at the same time. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. The name surprised me. "Ethan." Emily noticed immediately. "He is calling?" she asked. "Yes." "What are you going to do?" I thought about that for a moment. Years ago I would have felt nervous, defensive, maybe even desperate for approval. Now I simply felt calm. "I am going to answer." I pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. "Hello?" Ethan sounded unusually friendly. "Michael, good timing." I glanced at Emily. She was staring at the table. "What can I do for you?" I asked. There was a brief pause before he spoke again. His voice remained smooth and confident. "Actually, I was hoping you could help us out with something." The confidence in his tone told me he expected the conversation to go a certain way. What he did not know was that everything had already changed. He still believed he understood the situation. He still believed he understood me. And as he began explaining what he needed, Emily quietly closed her eyes because she already knew exactly what was coming next. For the next several minutes, I listened while Ethan explained the situation. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way a salesman chooses a presentation. According to him, there had been some temporary setbacks, unexpected expenses, timing issues, a few financial obligations that had piled up faster than anticipated. Then he finally arrived at the reason for the call. "We are a little behind on rent," he said. "I was hoping you could help us get through this month." Across the table, Emily stared silently at her coffee cup. She already knew what he did not. She knew I had seen the documents. She knew I understood far more than he realized. "How much?" I asked calmly. He named the amount. It was not a small number. Then he added something that caught my attention. It would only be temporary. I looked at Emily. She slowly closed her eyes. That told me everything I needed to know. "Ethan," I said, "when were you planning to tell me about the overdue balances?" The silence on the line was immediate. "What balances?" he asked. His voice changed slightly. Not panic, caution. "The ones from the property management company." Another pause. "This one lasted longer." "I am not sure what you mean." Emily finally looked up. "Stop." She said it quietly, but it carried more weight than anything else spoken that day. Ethan did not respond. "I showed him everything," she continued. "He knows." The confidence disappeared from Ethan's voice. "Emily, why would you do that?" "Because I am tired," she replied. "I am tired of pretending." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan sighed heavily. "This is not the way I wanted this conversation to happen." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because it was honest in a way he probably did not intend. The conversation he wanted was the one where I knew nothing, the one where I simply transferred money and asked no questions. Instead, the truth had arrived first. "Michael," he said carefully, "I know things have been complicated." "They have," I agreed. "But right now I am asking for help." Years earlier, I would have rushed to solve the problem. I would have convinced myself that helping financially would somehow repair relationships. But I was no longer that version of myself. "I am not sending money," I said. My voice remained calm, firm. "Nothing more." "You are not?" "No." Another silence followed. "Why?" he asked. I looked directly at Emily before answering. "Because support without honesty is not support. It is enablement." Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The truth did not require volume. Ethan eventually ended the call after a few awkward attempts to restart the conversation. When the screen went dark, Emily sat quietly for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I knew you would say that. Does that disappoint you?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." Her eyes filled with emotion she had been holding back for years. "Honestly, I think it is the first healthy boundary anyone has set in a long time." We left the cafe an hour later. The conversation had changed something important. The truth was finally in the open. The old patterns were broken. Yet as I watched Emily walk toward her car, I knew the real consequences had not arrived yet. Because sooner or later, Ethan was going to realize that the people around him were no longer playing the roles he expected them to play. Life did not magically become perfect after that afternoon. Real life rarely works that way. Some conversations were still difficult. Some wounds still needed time. Some questions did not have simple answers. But something important had changed. The confusion was gone. The uncertainty was gone. The constant feeling of standing outside my own life waiting for someone else to decide my value was gone. Over the months that followed, Emily and I slowly rebuilt a relationship that felt honest for the first time in years. Not rushed, not forced. Honest. Sometimes we met for coffee. Sometimes we walked through a local park. Sometimes we simply talked on the phone about ordinary things. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic promises, just consistency. And after everything that had happened, consistency mattered more than words. Ethan eventually had to face the consequences of his own decisions. Not because anyone punished him, because reality eventually demands payment for choices that appearances can only hide for so long. I did not celebrate that. I did not enjoy watching anyone struggle, But I also did not step in and rescue situations that were never mine to fix. That was one of the hardest lessons I learned. Helping someone and protecting them from every consequence are not the same thing. One creates growth. The other creates dependence. For years, I confused the two. I do not anymore. As for me, I kept working. I kept volunteering. I kept building a life that reflected who I actually was instead of who I hoped other people would see me as. The consulting projects continued. The restoration group continued. The friendships continued. And perhaps most importantly, my peace continued. One evening, nearly a year after that conversation in the cafe, Emily came by the house for dinner. We sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the maple tree Susan and I planted decades earlier. The same tree that had witnessed birthdays, graduations, holidays, laughter, grief, and everything in between. Emily looked at the tree and smiled. Mom would have loved how big it got. She would have, I said. For a while, we simply sat there in silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that only exists when people no longer feel the need to defend themselves. Before leaving, Emily hugged me and said something I will never forget. Thank you for finally teaching me that love and boundaries can exist at the same time. After she drove away, I sat alone on the porch for a while, not lonely, just reflective. I thought about everything that had happened. The disappointments, the misunderstandings, the mistakes, the growth. And I realized something simple. The most important relationship I rebuilt was not with my daughter, it was with myself. If there is one lesson this story taught me, it is that your value does not decrease simply because someone else fails to recognize it. Never hand another person the authority to define your worth. Protect your finances. Protect your emotional well-being. Protect your peace. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors that allow healthy people in while keeping unhealthy patterns out. And if you are listening right now while carrying your own disappointment, your own heartbreak, or your own family struggle, I want you to hear this from someone who spent far too many years learning it. You are allowed to stop chasing people who only appreciate you when they need something from you. You are allowed to heal. You are allowed to choose yourself without becoming selfish. Sometimes faith in God does not remove the storm. Sometimes it simply helps you keep walking until you reach clearer ground. Looking back now, I think my instincts were trying to tell me the truth long before my mind was ready to accept it. For that, I am grateful. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share this chapter of my life. Stories like these remind us that we are often less alone than we think. Somewhere out there, someone else is carrying a similar burden, asking similar questions, and searching for the same peace. My name is Michael Carter. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never sacrifice your self-respect in exchange for temporary acceptance. Before I went inside that evening, I noticed something hanging from a low branch of the maple tree. It was an old piece of ribbon from a family celebration years earlier. Faded, weathered, almost forgotten, yet somehow still holding on. I smiled, left it exactly where it was, and walked back into the house. Because some things survive not by staying perfect, but by remaining true to what they were meant to be. And perhaps that is the quietest kind of strength there is. If this story spoke to your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about family, resilience, personal growth, and finding peace after difficult seasons of life, there are many more waiting for you in the playlist. Some will make you reflect, some will surprise you, and some may help you see your own story in a new light. Until then, take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.